Okay, now that I have this geometry, these basic primitives that I've adjusted with different sections and different attributes, I'm going to begin to show some ways to modify these objects at the component level. So let's take this five-sided pyramid, for example, and I want to scale this in 2 dimensions, so I'll use my scale hotkey, which is R, and I will drag the green square, which turns yellow when I hover over it, and make an adjustment in 2 dimensions, or 2 axes, to the width of this pyramid. I can also drag one handle to adjust the height, and I can use W, my hotkey, to move it up. But let's say I want to begin to model some of these specific objects below, specific components. So I'm going to right-click on that object and select Face. You can also select faces by clicking on Components, Select by Component Type, and choosing Face Components. Now as I hover my mouse over these different faces, I'll be able to select them. And I can use my Move tool to move them up and down. Or I can scale them, my Scale tool. R is the hotkey for that. I can scale again in 2 axes. So I can also manipulate edges by right-clicking to select Edge. I can move specific edges. I can rotate other edges. I can also scale edges. And vertices, or vertex. I can move or rotate or scale each vertex one at a time. When I select more than one vertex and I scale them, they move together. Or I can scale them apart from each other. So I haven't made something very pretty here, but you can see that I begin to be able to manipulate these primitive objects in very fine detail, as fine as I want really. Now that I've destroyed this pyramid, let's look at this cylinder. Let's say I want to select an edge loop here in the middle and make an indentation. Maybe shift select so I can get a second edge loop, make another indentation, and now select a third edge loop, extend it out, and I have the beginnings of a jet engine. So being able to go from object mode into edge, vertex, or face mode will allow me a much greater degree of freedom to model things the way that I want them to be. This is where modeling gets really interesting, I think. Now what if I want to delete some components? Let's say I've got just too many of these sections here. If I go to face and I want to just delete a whole section of these faces. Well, with faces I can just go ahead and click the delete key and it'll get rid of what I've got selected. And you'll notice that I can see through that geometry on the back side. That is because in my viewport under shading I have back face culling switched on. If I turn that off, I'll be able to see geometry on both sides. But I leave it on because, first of all, most game engines will only draw one side of the polygon, so you need to know which side is facing out, or which side is going to be drawn, and that is the side that's called the normal. The back side of these polygons don't have normals, so they don't really have geometry. They don't have faces to be rendered. So I've deleted some faces. I don't want to leave that big hole in my object. I'll have to stitch that up later. But let's say I want to delete some edges too. Let's say I've got too many of these edges here in the middle, and maybe I'm still using this one and that one, but maybe it's better that I get rid of this one. I can just click the delete key to delete edges I have selected, but there's a problem with that. You can see that I've left some vertices floating out in the middle of these edges with nothing going on. Every vertex or set of vertices should have a purpose. It should be a juncture or a joint, an intersection between 2 or more edges. Now these do connect 2 edges, but we don't have any crossing going on. So those are essentially orphaned vertices. So I can leave them there, or I can also delete them. That won't leave a hole in the geometry. I'll only get a hole if I delete the faces. But the edges and the vertices, I can get rid of those with no problem. But let's say if I don't want to worry about deleting the edges and the points, I can go up to Edit Mesh under Edge and delete Edge/Vertex. You'll notice the hotkey for that is Control Delete. So I can Control Delete, and that'll take care of not just the edges but also the vertices that are left floating as orphans out in the middle of another edge. Those are gone now because I used the Delete Edge Vertex function. So now I have this jet engine. Still have a hole in the bottom of it, but I won't worry about that. Now let's say I want to change some of these edges. So let's look at this object without the wireframe showing. You can see where it's a sharp edge and where it's smooth. This is because by default I started with a cylinder, and the cylinder had smooth edges around and smooth edges on the cap, but it had a hard edge here at the rim where the curved edge of the cylinder meets the cap. I can control in Maya which edges are rendered to be hard edges and which are rendered to be soft. So let's say I go to edge mode and I select this edge here. Double click to get the whole edge loop. And if I want to soften that edge, I can go up to Normals, Soften Edge. You'll see now it's drawing differently. I'm getting a softened, smooth edge. Let's say in here I want to have a hard edge. select that edge loop, go to Normals, Harden Edge. Now I'll look at it in object mode, and you can see Maya is trying to draw a hard edge on the inside of that rim. But to really make that work, I probably need another hard edge in here, and maybe one in here, these loops. So I'll go to Normals, Harden Edge, and now we see starting to get some nice sharp ridges in there where I want them. Let's do one more. Normals, Harden Edge. Now with a little bit of texture, I can create a really interesting object. Let's look at this torus. I've lowered the geometry sections enough that Maya assumes that this doesn't need to be a smooth, rounded donut shape. Well, maybe I want it to be. So I'm going to just select all the edges on this object, go to Normals, Soften the Edge. Now I got my smooth donut shape back. By getting rid of some of my edges and vertices on this sphere using Control-Delete, I can begin to manipulate this object in a way that will allow me to shape it into something not quite so spherical. Now again, by default that sphere was very soft-edged. But let's say I want to make all these ridges into sharp, hard edges. So I'm going to select all these rings by Shift double-clicking them. Just the rings, Normals, Harden Edge, and then you can see we get a very stepped look, a very kind of mechanical look. But that's okay, sometimes you want a sharp edge.